In 1945, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl walked out of Auschwitz. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother. As a doctor observing thousands of people under the same conditions, he noticed that the ones who deteriorated fastest weren't necessarily the ones in the worst shape when they arrived, but the ones who had stopped believing there was something waiting for them on the other side. Frankl watched that happen in real time, in the worst possible conditions a human being can be placed in, and he spent the rest of his life building a theory around that observation. He called it logotherapy. The idea that the primary human drive is not pleasure, but meaning. Modern neuroscience took decades to catch up to what Frankl saw in those camps. And what he described as a psychiatrist matches what neuroscientists started measuring almost 70 years later. In 2009, a team of researchers at the University of Michigan gave a group of adults a simple task. They were asked to rate how much purpose they felt in their daily lives, and then tracked over the following years across dozens of health markers. The study, which followed nearly 7,000 people, found that those who scored lowest on purpose weren't just unhappier. They were getting sick faster. Higher rates of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, disrupted sleep. Their biology was responding to the presence or absence of direction the same way it responds to chronic stress. But this wasn't an isolated finding. A separate longitudinal study out of Japan tracked over 43,000 people for 7 years. Participants were asked a single question at the start: whether they had ikigai, a Japanese concept that translates roughly as a reason to get up in the morning. Those who answered no had significantly higher mortality from cardiovascular causes over the following years, even after controlling for lifestyle factors like smoking and exercise. What's striking about both studies isn't just the correlation between purpose and happiness. That part is intuitive. It's that the absence of purpose shows up in places you wouldn't expect, not just in mood or motivation, but in the systems that keep you alive. Frankl saw the extreme version of this in the camps. Modern epidemiology is seeing the diluted version of it everywhere else, in offices, in retirement, in the slow drift that happens when someone reaches a goal they spent years chasing and finds nothing waiting on the other side. The brain, it turns out, wasn't built to coast. So, what does the brain do when it has no direction? Marcus Rachel at Washington University started finding answers in the late 1990s, almost by accident. He was studying brain activity during focused tasks when he noticed something unexpected in the data. A network of regions that became consistently more active when people weren't doing anything. A resting brain was supposed to be a quiet brain, but Rachel's data suggested the opposite. He called it the default mode network, the state the brain returns to in the absence of external demands. It wasn't until later studies started mapping what the default mode network actually does that the findings became impossible to ignore. This network is responsible for self-referential thought, replaying past events, constructing a narrative about who you are and where you're going. The mental simulation that never quite stops. When you're lying awake at 3 a.m., turning the same thought over repeatedly, that's the default mode network running. A 2019 meta-analysis in NeuroImage reviewed 14 fMRI studies and found that rumination, repetitive, self-critical thinking strongly associated with depression, correlates specifically with hyperactivity in this network. The more a brain lacks external direction, the more that region dominates. What Rachel found as a curiosity in a lab at Washington University turns out to be the same mechanism Frankl was observing in Auschwitz. A brain that has lost its orientation doesn't go quiet. It turns on itself. What Frankl argued, and what neuroscience has since started to confirm, is that this isn't irreversible. So the question is what it actually takes to reorient a brain that has lost its direction. In the early 2000s, Carol Riff at the University of Wisconsin spent years trying to measure something that most researchers considered too vague to quantify: the active presence of something that made life feel worth sustaining. What she found, across large longitudinal samples, was that the single strongest predictor of sustained well-being wasn't positive emotion or life satisfaction. It was purpose, what she called a sense that one's life has direction and meaning. But the more interesting finding came from the neuroscience that followed her work. When researchers started scanning the brains of people who scored high on Rift's purpose measures, they found something consistent: reduced activity in the default mode network at rest and stronger connectivity in the prefrontal regions associated with goal-directed behavior. The brain, when it has genuine orientation, doesn't just feel different. It operates differently. What this suggests is that purpose isn't functioning like a mood. It's functioning like an organizing signal, something the brain uses to decide where to allocate attention, how to interpret setbacks, and whether a given situation warrants a stress response. Frankl described this from the inside. He wrote that prisoners who could locate meaning in their suffering, not justify it, just locate it within something larger, maintained a psychological coherence that others couldn't sustain. Neuroscience wouldn't exist for decades. But what he was describing functionally was a brain with an organizing signal intact. The question that remains is whether that signal can be deliberately constructed or whether it only arrives on its own terms. So, can purpose be deliberately built? The short answer, based on the available evidence, is yes, but not in the way most people expect. The intuitive assumption is that purpose is something you find, a calling that arrives, a moment of clarity, a passion you either have or you don't. That framing is everywhere. In career advice and self-help, in the way people talk about meaning as though it were an object misplaced somewhere that needs to be located. But the research tells a different story. Michael Steger at Colorado State University has spent over 2 decades studying how people construct meaning. What his work consistently shows is that purpose isn't discovered passively. It's generated through engagement. People who report the strongest sense of meaning in their lives aren't the ones who waited for clarity. They're the ones who committed to something before the clarity arrived. A 2021 study published in Nature Human Behavior found that goal-directed behavior, even toward modest, self-chosen objectives, activates the brain's reward circuitry and suppresses default mode activity within days of consistent engagement. The brain doesn't wait for the goal to feel meaningful before it starts reorganizing around it. It starts reorganizing as soon as the behavior becomes consistent. This is close to what Frankl observed in the camps, though he framed it differently. He noticed that prisoners who invented reasons to survive held together longer than those waiting for a reason to appear. In some cases, the reasons were constructed almost entirely from imagination. The brain, it seems, doesn't distinguish very carefully between a purpose that was handed to you and one you built yourself. What it responds to is the presence of direction, something that tells it where the next step points. The mistake most people make isn't that they lack purpose, it's that they're waiting for it to feel certain before they act on it. In studies where participants were asked to track their daily activities and rate how meaningful each felt, the people who reported the highest sense of overall purpose weren't doing dramatically different things. They were doing ordinary things: work, relationships, routines, but with an explicit connection to something they had decided mattered. The decision came first, and then the feeling followed. In practical terms, this means the entry point isn't finding the right purpose. It's picking a direction that's close enough and moving. Not because the direction is guaranteed to be correct, but because the brain needs consistent movement to start generating the signal that makes movement feel meaningful. Frankl wrote about this without the neuroscience to back it up. He described meaning not as something that could be invented arbitrarily, but as something that revealed itself through commitment, through the act of showing up to something repeatedly until its significance became visible. He called it the self-transcendence of human existence. The idea that meaning isn't found by looking inward, but by pointing outward towards something beyond yourself and walking toward it. And the research, 70 years later, largely agrees. Frankl survived Auschwitz, rebuilt his career, remarried, and lived until 92. He gave lectures until he was in his 80s, climbed mountains, learned to fly a plane in his 60s. People who knew him described someone who seemed genuinely unbothered by the ordinary frustrations that consume most lives. There's a line he wrote that doesn't get quoted as often as his more famous ones. He said that the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, from hour to hour. That it's not a question to be answered once and carried forward. It's something the brain has to keep orienting toward. A direction that gets chosen, lost, and chosen again. What Frankl figured out in a concentration camp, and what researchers have spent decades mapping in laboratories, is the same thing. That a brain with somewhere to go is a fundamentally different machine than one left to wander. The only question worth sitting with is where yours is pointed right now.